Okay, what we're going to look at here today, and is the first part of this topic. The second part we'll be covering tomorrow, because this chapter does cover two things in one, but they are related, so it does make sense. So today what we're going to be looking at is the rise of big business. So what that's looking at is, in the late 19th century, we see the United States becomes a very powerful industrial nation, and coinciding with that, we see the development of large, powerful business entities, corporations that begin to corner a large part of their respective markets. So we're going to look at why that happened and what some of the examples of that were in the 19th century. All right. First thing, though, we want to put out why at this time period this is going to happen. So, why is it that all of a sudden in the late 19th century, that is when we start to see the development of big business and industry? Okay, so the reason being is because we have all these factors that are at play. Okay, and in the late 19th century, they combined to create an environment in which big business could be possible. So what do we have? Okay, so the first point, unskilled and semi-skilled labor were in abundance. There was a large population in the United States of unskilled and semi-skilled workers in need of jobs, and industrial work was suited to that. So that made big business possible. And abundant capital, or lots of money, because we were a fairly wealthy country, which could be then reinvested in the development of business. As we're going to see, there was a new talented group of businessmen or entrepreneurs that were emerging that would use their kind of business savvy to kind of create America's first big business. We'll be talking about some of those individuals here today. You do need to know them by name. Okay, the market within the United States is growing. I mean, when I say market, I mean the people who could be sold to, because our nation was growing in size. That meant there was more opportunities to sell stuff to people. And anytime there's opportunity to sell stuff, business will fill that void and try and produce to make money, right? This is an important one we'll be getting to here shortly. Government was willing to help at all levels to stimulate economic growth. We're going to talk about this in detail today, that the government and its policies were geared towards facilitating the development of big business. Okay, so when we look at economic policies of the late 19th century, they catered to big business. Okay, abundant natural resources. We were a very wealthy country that was home to lots of natural resources. That is one of the reasons why we are such a successful nation. You look at the United States and everything that we have here. We're a large country, and a lot of the resources that are here were just necessary for the development of industry. So you look at, not only land, but you look at, we were home to large deposits of oil and iron, timber, coal. All these things were necessary in the late 19th century to promote industrialization. So it just so happened we were lucky. The land that we lived on happened to be very valuable and rich with natural resources. And then lastly, the first thing we're going to talk about today, which is the last thing on here, is technological innovation. One of the things that contributed to the rise of big business in the 19th century was technology had advanced to a point where new innovations and new inventions, would make it possible. Okay, so it's almost like we see the late 19th century. It's almost like someone flipped the switch, and all of a sudden we have all these new technologies, all these new inventions, and of course all these new businesses developing. Okay, and it kind of sets the stage for the 20th century, which is what we're moving towards, and we're going to be talking about soon. This is how we go from the 19th century to the 20th century, and this is kind of bridging the gap. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is innovations and inventors and contributions that, in terms of technology, that made this possible. We have talked about this a little bit already this year, but now we're into another era. So in the late 1800s, we saw a lot of technological innovations that would pave the way for a new industrial America. And one of the people who was a major kind of figure in that was, of course, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, who I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, at least you've heard his name, is possibly America's most prolific inventor in its history. Edison and his lab are credited with creating over 1,000 different unique patents on devices. Okay, some of which, of course, became very important. His most notable contribution that most people know him for is the creating the efficient, long-lasting light bulb. He did not invent the light bulb. People say, "Oh, I just invented the light bulb." He did not invent the light bulb. However, he did create a light bulb that was reliable and could burn for many, many hours. So therefore, it made it cost-effective and efficient. So in that regard, he did invent the modern light bulb in the sense that the light bulbs that were created as a result were based on his research, and it's what gave us electric light really in this country. I mean, that alone is a major contribution. But of course, he also patented all kinds of other devices, everything from a phonograph, which is kind of like a record player, to recording devices, to even motion picture cameras. So he like I said, he had a lot of different contributions. But probably his most considerable one that in terms of its impact on America was, of course, the electric light. Now, other people, Alexander Graham Bell, so we got to mention, because of course his invention was also every bit as revolutionary as the light bulb. Of course, Alexander Graham Bell is the creator of the telephone. Okay, and of course the telephone would replace the previous technology, the telegraph, as the predominant means of communication. Okay, and of course it was much better than the telegraph because the telegraph required an operator who had to interpret the signal and write the message down and deliver the telegram, whereas the telephone, while it did require an operator to connect two lines, once you were connected, of course, you could speak directly to another person. And of course, by the turn of the century, the telephone was becoming more and more complex, even in people's homes in the early 20th century. So of course, today we all have phones. All right, other technological innovations. The Bessemer process was a major innovation from the 19th century. We're going to be talking about more here shortly. The Bessemer process was a way of making steel. Okay? Now, steel had been around for centuries. Steel is nothing new. Okay? However, the ability to mass produce steel in a cheap, efficient way was new. And that's what the Bessemer process did. It allowed the mass production of cheap steel. Okay? Which meant steel was more plentiful and affordable, which meant it could be used for more things. And what we see is, starting in the turn of the century, we start to see steel being more commonly used for things like railroad building and even construction and building skyscrapers and bridges and things like that. And that was made possible by the Bessemer process. And of course, steel becomes a major industry for America. It's one of our most important industries, so we owe a lot to the Bessemer process in our country's history. Okay, here's another one. Electricity, alternating current. Okay? So with the need for electricity for things like the light bulb, okay, there was a demand for delivering electricity to cities, homes, okay? And there was competition to see what method of electricity being generated and delivered would be used. And there was competing methods. The two competing methods in the 19th century were alternating current and direct current, AC/DC. Okay? Thomas Edison, his version of electricity was direct current. However, the version of that was accepted and it became the most popular used in America and still pretty much the basis of our electrical system today is alternating current. Alternating current was invented by the research of a scientist by the name of Nikola Tesla. However, it was patented and delivered by a businessman by the name of George Westinghouse. So combined, Westinghouse and Tesla, they developed this alternating current, which was much more effective than direct current. Direct current, it required more power plants, and the electricity couldn't travel as far, whereas the alternating current was much more efficient. So this is the version of electricity in America that eventually took hold and worked. And like I said today, when we talk about electricity and how much we use it for, this is still, obviously it's advanced, but this is still at its heart the basis of our electricity today, is this method. So you can think about how this was changing. Electricity became one of our major power sources, and it was kind of help fuel our industrialization. All right, now let's move away from technology, and now let's start talking about philosophy, economic philosophy a little bit. Because this is actually one of the more complicated things in the entire chapter that you need to get, because it's really important. So when we talk about things that contributed to industrialization in the 19th century, we have to talk a little bit about economics. And in the 19th century, the United States largely subscribed to an economic philosophy, okay, of capitalism known as laissez-faire capitalism. Okay, so let's do a little background on economics real quick, because most of you here probably have not been exposed to it. So, the United States, as most other countries in the world, largely subscribes to the principles of capitalism. Okay, we are a capitalistic nation, mostly. Okay, and all that means, if you don't know what that means, is in capitalism, the means of production, which means the products that are made and the factories that make them, are owned by private citizens. Capitalism is characterized by private ownership of property and business. Okay, so for example, when you go to the store to buy something, let's say you go to Walmart, okay, you buy something at Walmart, okay, you're buying that product is made by a private corporation and it's being sold at it by another privately owned business, okay? And the profits there go to private citizens, the people who own the companies. Okay, the products are not owned by the government, they are not sold by the government, okay? So in a capitalist society, the means of production is owned by individual citizens. Okay, and that is the case for most of the production in our country. And that's why we're a capitalistic nation, because most of the production is carried out by private citizens. Now, what is laissez-faire capitalism? Laissez-faire capitalism is capitalism. Okay, but when we talk about laissez-faire, okay, which loosely translates to let alone or let it be, okay, laissez-faire means a capitalistic system in which the government exercises very little or no, usually no, control or regulation over business. Okay? In a laissez-faire capitalistic society, the government does not regulate business. Instead, business is left to function on its own with little regulation, okay, under the belief that what is best for business is for it to be able to operate unimpeded by any kind of constraints. Okay? Okay, people who subscribe to laissez-faire capitalism would argue that businesses are most successful for the good of all when the government basically says, we're going to keep our hands off. You'll hear that a lot of times when they talk about laissez-faire, hands-off policy. Okay? Which means no government rules, no government regulations on business. Businesses are free to succeed and fail on their own with no interference. Okay? And this was the principal belief of the day, okay? Capitalism, which is, a lot of the work from the 18th century economist Adam Smith, was the predominant economic system used by most of the countries of the world, including the United States. And in the 19th century, we took that to the extreme. We said, okay, laissez-faire capitalism is the best system. So what that means is, not only did government not interfere with business and let businesses do whatever they want, in some cases, government actually actively promoted the interests of business. Okay? Now, this was good for business, and businesses made a lot of money. Now, there will be, of course, a downside. The downside of laissez-faire capitalism is that with very little government regulation, oftentimes businesses will engage in practices that can sometimes be harmful to us, the consumer, but also harmful to the workers. Because if you think about what when we say no rules or regulations, what are we talking about? Well, that means there's no rules on who you can hire. So that allowed the hiring of 8-year-old children to go into coal mines, right? Because that's a rule. Now, there was no rule against that. Okay? Or what about rules that prevent businesses from selling harmful products to us? Okay, today that's illegal. You can't sell a product that can hurt you. Back in those days they could, because under laissez-faire capitalism there were no rules or regulations. Okay? So this was a little bit of a different time. Today we are still very much capitalistic. However, we have moved a little bit further away from the whole laissez-faire capitalism system because we realize, okay, there are some instances in which businesses do need to be regulated. But even today we still debate this. Now if you take that a step further, you can also apply a lot of the theories of economics to even, not just the business world, but also to social life. Okay? And in the 19th century, there was another philosophy that was being circulated that will become very influential and shape America, known as social Darwinism. This is also another tricky thing that's in the chapter this week, so let's make sure we talk about this. So, in the 19th century, the science world was all abuzz about these new scientific theories of evolution and natural selection that were being promoted by a scientist by the name of Charles Darwin. I'm sure you guys have mostly heard about in your science class, right? You guys know Darwin? All right. So Darwin was saying that in nature, he was arguing that animals evolve over time, okay, based on the principles of natural selection, meaning animals that are better suited to survive in an environment will, and those that are not as suited will die out and go extinct. And through this process, evolution takes place. Okay? So only, you've heard probably the term survival of the fittest, right? Now, if you take that theory of evolution, survival of the fittest, and natural selection, and you apply it to the business world and to the human world, you get social Darwinism. Social Darwinists would argue that in life, in human life, as like in nature, some people are better equipped to succeed than others. Some people are smarter, more talented, okay? And that they should be allowed to succeed, and that those that are not as well equipped to succeed should be allowed to fail. And social Darwinists would argue that the government should not interfere. The government should not try to balance the playing field. The government should stay out of it, and that people should be allowed to succeed or fail on their own. And that also would occur in the business world. So through social Darwinism, we see the argument that, and it kind of supports laissez-faire capitalism, that businesses and people should not be subjected to any kind of government interference, and that people should be allowed to succeed or fail based on the laws of natural selection. Okay? Now, this did also start to take a darker turn in the 19th century, because many social Darwinists also continued to take that thought, and they took it to the extreme, arguing that certain races were superior to others. So many social Darwinists also ultimately subscribe to ideas of racism, the idea that some races were just naturally superior to others. Okay? So, like I said, you got to be kind of careful with this thing, because like I said, if you take it to its extreme, you can kind of get into that racist component. But anyway, social Darwinism also kind of promoted the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. The idea is, well, businesses are like people, they're like animals. They should be allowed to succeed and fail on their own. And if they are successful, they should be left alone. If they fail, they should also be left alone. Okay? So as we go forward, we talk about the development of business. You got to consider these two things. They both had a major influence on how we treated business. Which leads us to the most important part. Okay? The rise of trust. This is probably the most single important thing here we're talking about today. So you definitely want to know about the trust. That's a very important term. Remember nothing else. Remember that. So what are we talking about here? So, in the late 19th century, we started to see the development of large, very powerful business entities. Okay? They were so powerful and so wealthy that they were able to corner the entire market for their particular business. Okay? These become known as the trusts. That's what they called them back then. They called them trusts. Although I would say, for your purposes, you could probably consider the word trust almost synonymous with monopolies. Okay? And a monopoly, of course, is a situation in which a single business controls all of an entire product or service. Okay, now today we look down on monopolies. We don't like that, and we actually have laws against monopolies. But in the 19th century, that was not necessarily the case. Right? Because remember, laissez-faire. So there were various trusts that had control over major shares of certain industries. So if you look at this cartoon, this is a very famous cartoon called The Bosses of the Senate. Okay? You see the Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, the Oil Trust, the Iron Trust, the Sugar Trust, the Coal Trust. Okay? So these were major businesses who controlled most of that single industry. And in some cases, they controlled almost all of it, which is what we would call a monopoly. Now, we had never seen anything like this before, because historically in the United States to this point, various businesses have been controlled by a whole variety of different other smaller businesses who would compete with one another. Okay, and that was good, because under capitalism, and I don't want to get too much into the economics thing, but you do need to know a little economics in this class. Under capitalism, competition is good. Competition is the essence of capitalism. Okay, why is that the case? Because competition, theoretically, causes businesses to continuously create better and better products as they try to compete for our dollar. Okay? And the example I always give is cell phones, because that's the best modern day example. Cell phones are the best example. Okay? Because every year, every cell phone company puts out a new cell phone. Why? Because they want to make their next model needs to be better than the other guys, because they want you to buy it. So what we get is every year, theoretically, every year we get better and better cell phones because of competition. And also they, theoretically, to try and be competitive, they try to keep that cost as low as possible, so they have a better, cheaper product than their competitor. Okay, so competition is good for us, the consumer, because it constantly gives us cheaper and better quality products. Now, what happens if you eliminate competition? Now you got a problem. If there is no competition, let's say tomorrow all the other cell phone companies go out of business, the only one left is Apple, right? The iPhone. Well, now Apple can make a piece of junk phone, and they can charge you whatever they want for it, because guess what? What choice do you have? That's called a monopoly. Okay? And that's what we started to see happen in the 19th century, is these large trusts began to dominate their industry to the point where they could basically dictate price and quality of product without any competition. This became a real problem eventually. But at the time, it was perfectly legal. Now, who were in charge of these trusts? Well, we see several prominent businessmen rise throughout the 19th century and become the leading captains of industry for their different respective fields. So these are people you need to know. You definitely want to know some of these people's names. They were very influential, powerful figures. Okay, so you have the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius Vanderbilt. We call him Commodore. Okay? The Vanderbilts were the leading family, leading name in the railroad construction industry. And railroads were our single biggest business at this point. Okay, so that means they controlled the majority of the rail lines of any single trust or business at the time, which gave them immense power. Okay, because of course the railroads were our single most important transportation method we had in the 19th century. Okay. All right, you got John Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company, one of the biggest single trusts in American history. Okay, Rockefeller and his company Standard Oil managed to control the majority of the nation's oil. Okay, he did this by, of course, eliminating competition, buying up competitors, okay, and then eventually controlling the majority of the oil supply. And of course, we all know how important oil is even today. So Rockefeller and Standard Oil, definitely want to know his name. Okay, you got Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie made his fortune in steel production with the Bessemer process. And all of his different steel plants, many of which were located in Pittsburgh. Hence why today you got the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh was a very important city for the development of steel. Okay, if you ever travel to Pittsburgh, anyone been to Pittsburgh? Okay, you'll find Carnegie's name all over the place. Okay, we'll talk more about why in a little bit, because he's important there as well for other things. And then finally, we got J.P. Morgan, who was the richest person in America at the turn of the century. J.P. Morgan made his fortune in banking and finance, and of course later on he actually bought out U.S. Steel, which was Carnegie's company. So he was also a steel man. But like I said, he actually goes on to become America's first billionaire. He was the first billionaire in American history, and he made $1 billion, at the turn of the century. So if you think about how much of $1 billion is today, imagine $1 billion at the turn of the century. I mean, that's some serious money. So that just kind of shows you just how much money these guys are making and how much influence they had. Okay, but they got these positions and they built these trusts by exploiting the laws of the time and eliminating competition until basically they and their companies controlled the vast majority of the market for whatever oil or steel or whatever. And this was all perfectly legal back in those days. Okay, you could have monopoly. It was all perfectly legal. There was nothing against that. Today we do have laws against monopolies. Now, the positive of this, of course, was these major corporations were increasing our industrial production. You know, you look here, look at steel production. Okay, that steel production remains relatively low, and then towards the late 1800s, it just skyrockets. Okay, and this shows you that, you know, these large-scale business enterprises, you know, they could produce a lot of, you know, products. Okay, it had to do with the technology at the time, as long as, but also with some of the other things we talked about, you know, the time was right. You know, there was a lot of workers, there was a huge demand, so we became the #1 steel producer in the world during this time period. Made us very wealthy. Okay, now how did they do this? Like, what were the business enterprises that these guys were engaging in that allowed them to create these trusts? Well, one of the methods they used, or two of the methods they used, were called horizontal and vertical integration. This is going to be a little tricky, so let's talk about this. Okay, horizontal and vertical integration. So horizontal and vertical integration were methods that these business tycoons used to create the trusts. Okay, to create these monopolies. Okay, horizontal integration was pretty straightforward. Horizontal integration called for buying up your competitors in the same field so as to eliminate competition. Okay, so for example, let's make this real easy. If we were a railroad company, we might buy up other railroads to eliminate competition so that we could control the market and charge whatever we want. Okay, which was actually very commonplace back in those days. The railroads would oftentimes try to buy up their competition, and once they had bought up their competition, they would then jack up the rates because people would be forced to pay whatever you asked because there was no competing rail line. Okay, they knew they could get away with this. Okay, it was all perfectly legal. Okay, that's horizontal integration because on this chart you're moving horizontally. Look, we're buying more railroads going this way. And what about vertical? Vertical integration is a little different. Vertical integration is where you try to decrease the cost of doing business by buying up other businesses that are associated with you doing your business. So for example, I'll give you another one. Once again, we're a railroad company. Through vertical integration, we might buy up other types of companies that we need to run our railroad. For example, we might buy a coal mine. And why would a railroad company want a coal mine? Well, we want the coal to fuel our railroads, our trains. So we buy a coal mine so that we can use that coal at a lower cost or free of charge, however you want to look at it, to help fuel our roads and increase our profits. Okay? Or, you know, maybe we're we're an oil company. And we also buy up the pipelines that deliver the oil to our customers. Okay, that will benefit us as well. Okay, so using these methods, the name of the game here, I mean, look, and any of you who are looking to go into business, I mean, this is basic stuff. You know, the name of the game here was eliminating competition. The less competition you face, the more profitable, okay, your business will be. Now the point, though, becomes, though, that if you eliminate all competition, okay, now it becomes bad for us, the consumer, because when there is no competition, as I said before, there is no incentive for the producer to make a high-quality, cheap product. Instead, they can do whatever they want. Which is why today we have laws against monopolies. But once again, 19th century, under laissez-faire, there were no laws against monopolies. Okay? And as you can see from mergers, and mergers means when two companies join together to create a single big company, okay, or super company, whatever you want to call it. Through mergers, the number of corporations decreased, which meant that the remaining ones were more powerful than ever before, and there was decreased competition once again. Okay? Which was great for profits for these businesses, but not so great for the consumers who were being exploited. Okay, now associated with this, and we're going to talk more, this is something we're going to talk more about tomorrow, but I do want to mention it now. Associated with what's going on here, we also see work is also being changed and reorganized. Okay? In order to maximize profits, factories were retooled to exploit the abundance of unskilled and semi-skilled labor. Okay? The people who worked in these factories did not have high levels of skills. That's it. Okay? So what they did was they created factories that used what we would call the assembly line model today, in which a bunch of workers, instead of being trained in a lot of skills to create a product from start to finish, rather than do that, because that would cost more, because you need to train them, and they can then demand higher wages because they have skills. Rather, the factories were set up so that people were doing menial, simple tasks repetitively all day long. And by doing this, they could hire workers who had no skills, and then, of course, pay them very low wages and work them long hours. Because, once again, if people complain, you can simply fire them and replace it with another unskilled worker who could easily step in and take over that job, because the job did not require any skills. Okay? So, businesses were not only making money, but they were exploiting the worker situation in order to do so. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, because there will be a backlash. Workers will eventually say, hey, you can't do this to us. We're going to fight back. But for the time, this is what was going on with work. Okay? Now, because workers were being exploited and they were not getting paid, and because the business tycoons were making millions and even billions of dollars, what we see is as the 19th century goes on, there eventually is some criticism laid on these wealthy businessmen. Okay? And towards the end of the 19th century, we see people start to criticize big business for making record profits, like you see here, these guys, okay, off of the backs, you can make it out down there, off the backs of their low-paid labor. Okay? And by the late 19th century, many Americans began questioning whether, our economic system, which was channeling tons and tons of profits in the hands of a very few people, was really the best system and the way to do things. Okay, which caused people to question, does laissez-faire capitalism really serve the best interests of everyone? Okay, and one of the common terms, and I want you to be familiar with, that was being tossed around in the late 19th century was the term robber baron. Okay, many of these, business tycoons like Carnegie and Rockefeller were oftentimes labeled in a derogatory way robber baron. Okay, what that means is, this is likening them back to the Middle Ages. Back during the Middle Ages in Europe, time in England and all that, France, okay, the wealthy nobles who ran everything would exploit the peasants, the serf class, okay, to enrich themselves. And many people argue that in the 19th century, these captains of industry, these robber barons, as they were called, okay, were just like the robber barons of old, and that they were exploiting their workers for their own personal profit. Okay? So not everything that was being said about these guys was positive. There was a lot of negative being said because people felt like it wasn't fair how much money was being channeled in the hands of a few individuals, okay, at the expense of everyone else. And additionally, there was another growing concern, and this is, you could take this right from the headlines today, this is still something we talk about today. Another growing concern was, with as much money and as much power as these guys had, people began now to question whether they had influence over our government. Because when you have that much money and power, even the government of the United States could be subject to your influence. Okay? All right, so here you look at this cartoon, very famous cartoon. Here's John Rockefeller, and he's holding the government in his hand. He's saying, what a funny little government. And it's the trust giant's point of view. Because the point of view of the trust was these guys were so rich and powerful to them, it was almost like the government was beneath them. Okay? And talk about today. I mean, in the last few years, hasn't that been a major topic? Is that, big business has become so wealthy, so powerful, that it's become a major problem influencing our political system. Okay? It's been talked about a lot lately because, of course, a few years ago, if you guys follow the news, a few years ago, the Supreme Court changed the rules to basically allow businesses and whoever to invest as much money as they want into elections, which has made it so that billionaires and millionaires have changed the course of elections by donating millions and millions of dollars to certain campaigns. And this has been a big issue. So you could literally take this cartoon right here. Here's your synthesis. I'll give it to you. You take this cartoon, you change that Rockefeller there to the name of a different billionaire today, any billionaire, okay, who's involved in supporting candidates in elections, and it's all of a sudden relevant again. So, this is why this stuff's important. We're still talking about these same things even today. Okay? So just consider that. Okay, let's finish up. Now, I don't want to make it sound like these guys were all bad. You know, so they were not breaking any laws. They were doing everything perfectly legal. They were, you know, of course, enriching themselves. But this was all on the up and up in the 19th century. Now, some of these you know, wealthy industrialists did give back. Most notably, Andrew Carnegie, that's Carnegie there. Carnegie advocated for something what he called the gospel of wealth. Okay, this is a term for this week, so you definitely want to know. The gospel of wealth. Okay, so what is that? So Carnegie argued that millionaires and billionaires should use their funds not to just live an extravagant lifestyle, because he argued against that. He said rather they should use their funds to give back to the community. Okay, he said it was their duty. He said there was nothing more sinful than dying a rich man. So what he advocated was, he said that millionaires and billionaires should use their wealth, and before they die, they should donate much of that money back through developing public works and building opportunities for poor people to, of course, better themselves. Okay? Now, what did that mean? That mean giving out money just to random strangers? No, he didn't believe in that. He didn't think you should give out handouts to anyone. But what he said is you should use your money to build things like libraries, colleges and universities, okay? Even public parks, okay? To create opportunities that everyone can use to then, of course, help better themselves and hopefully enrich themselves one day. Now, part of this was kind of a selfish view amongst the billionaire class and millionaire class, that they knew what was best, that, you know, the money was best left up to them to distribute, because them being wealthy, they clearly would argue, say, hey, look, we know what's best. We you know, made ourselves successful. We know how to make some, you know, people successful. But people like Carnegie did walk the walk. You know, before Carnegie died, he gave a large chunk of his fortune back to charity and created, you know, universities and things like that. Okay, which is why I mentioned earlier, if you go to Pittsburgh, you'll find Carnegie's name is plastered all over the place, because he used his money to, you know, build a lot of things right there in that city. Okay, but other, you know, millionaires and captains of industry did the same. So this was also a very common concept around the time period. All right, now what about the government regulating business? Okay, we talked about all the problems caused by big business being unregulated. What about the government? Did the government try to regulate business? Well, yes and no. Okay, in 1890 we get the very first significant attempt by government to regulate business. This is known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. You definitely want to know this. Sherman Antitrust Act. It's right there in the name, antitrust, right? The purpose of the Sherman Antitrust Act was to try and bring the trusts under control, to kind of get them in line so they would stop engaging in these practices that eliminated competition that hurt everyone. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act was very ineffective. The law, while it had a good intention, was worded so weakly that the law really was, you know, unenforceable. Okay? It lacked teeth, as they say. What that means, when a law lacks teeth, it means it's not, you know, enforceable. It doesn't actually have binding language that punishes those who break the law very effectively. So while the Sherman Antitrust Act was intended to control the trusts and eliminate monopolies, it ultimately did not really do that at all. Okay, it failed. And it will not be until the early 20th century that we actually start to see some meaningful legislation that will actually bring the trusts under control. So while this was a good early attempt at controlling the trusts, okay, in reality, it did actually very little to impede them. Okay, so the trust will continue on going into the 20th century. All right, let's finish up. Now, the benefit, of course, of all this big business was, of course, increasing industrial output. And if you look at the United States, which is the blue here, this is 1880. 1880, we had about 15% of the world's industrial output. By 1900, that number had increased to 24%, and by 1913, 32%, surpassing Britain. Britain, who had been the world's leading, here's Britain right here. Britain, who had been the world's leading industrial power in the 19th century, by the 20th century had been overtaken by the United States. Okay, so by the early 20th century, the United States was the world's greatest industrial power, which also made us the world's wealthiest power. So as a result of industrialization, we became the wealthiest country in the world. And of course, one of the most powerful going into the 20th century. Okay, so that was, of course, the positive effect of all this. All right, so summary, here we go, just finishing up. This just kind of summarizes everything I said, but it might be nice to have it in a nice little short, concise way for you. So during the late 19th century, big business developed as a result of industrial growth. This was made possible by the political and economic philosophy of the time. Laissez-faire capitalism, social Darwinism. Powerful captains of industry eliminated competition and developed trust. So we're talking about people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt. You know those names? As the wealth and the power of the trust grew, critics argued for governmental control over big business. Okay, things like the Sherman Act, however, they were largely ineffective. And the end result of all this is by the turn of the century, the U.S. was the world's greatest industrial power. Okay, so we were transitioning from an agrarian society. Now, by the turn of the century, we were an industrial society, which means most people, our work and most of our income was being created in this country through industrial production rather than agriculture. Agriculture is still important, don't get me wrong, I'm not taking anything away from that, I'm just saying this is also a thing now. Okay? Okay. That's it. Any questions? Let me get up for a second, finish up. All right, what we'll do tomorrow now, we just talked about the rich people, the people who are making all the money, okay? So now we got to talk about the other end, the workers. So what we're going to do tomorrow is we'll talk about who is actually doing all the work and how they are being treated and all that stuff. Okay, so we'll talk about the other end of the spectrum tomorrow.